It's the end of the year and the days are short, so I'm thinking about time and software, of course.
Heather thinks about software.
Recently, President-elect Trump announced that he wants to get rid of daylight savings time. I was pleased to hear this because that means he has at least one policy objective that I support. But like all his promises, it remains to be seen whether he can or seriously intends to accomplish it. And so I started thinking about one of the most important aspects of daylight savings time, which is, you guessed it, software. In theory, daylight savings time should be easy for software to process. After all, most representations of time in software are done in UTC. This stands for Coordinated Universal Time. And yes, it seems like it should be CUT instead. At first I thought maybe the people who thought up the acronym were dyslexic, but then I read that the acronym and the name were a committee decision, which figures. To account for DST, software uses UTC, adjusted for both the local time zone and then DST. Time zones are quite complicated to determine, and so DST is a kind of child's play in comparison. In a way, the technique for calculating local time has been pre-disastered. Back in 1999, the Y2K panic, the disaster that wasn't, paved the way for more standardized representations of time in software systems. Even so, processing DST is not without its challenges. Different countries and even local geographic areas have different rules about DST, when it starts, when it ends, and whether they use it at all. Even if you calculate from UTC, you still have to keep current on any changes to local DST rules, which are by no means static. Software programmers usually process time in UTC only because otherwise, calculating the lapse of time between two data points can be wrong. It's also tricky to calculate time differences on the day of the DST change, which causes local time to be discontinuous. When the clocks change, two different actual times can be identical, or their difference can even be reversed. UTC hews to a standard called ISO 8601. When it comes to time, standards are good. In UTC, Z is the zone designator for zero UTC offset. The Z stands for zero and sometimes is called Zulu time, Zulu being the NATO phonetic alphabet entry for the letter Z, or Z in most Anglophone countries. Local times are then expressed by their offset from UTC Zulu. By the way, for you grammar police out there, DST is referred to as both daylight savings time and daylight saving time, plural and singular. Sorry to take the wind out of your next social media rant. Because programmers are already accustomed to using UTC and keeping up with changing local rules about DST, software would not be a gating item to dispensing with DST. Of course, there are likely to be some glitches, but most of us who do regular international phone calls have experienced this already, and we all survived. And what about whether DST is a good idea and whether Trump can or will actually get rid of it? Well, there are loads of people who say DST is a good idea and loads who say that it isn't. There are studies saying it saves energies and those saying it doesn't. Of course, most of the people watching this channel are pretty smart, so I don't have to explain that DST does not actually change the number of hours of daylight, only when they happen relative to the clock. The main thing, though, is that no one seems to be sure why DST was started in the first place or why it persists. Wikipedia tells us, for example, that it is a common myth in the United States that DST was first implemented for the benefit of farmers, who are actually mostly against it. Retailing, sports, and tourism interests have historically favored daylight saving, while agricultural and evening entertainment interests have opposed it. So, as one wag on Quora put it, golf courses versus movie theaters. Wikipedia also says some religious groups have opposed DST on religious grounds. For religious Muslims and Jews, it makes religious practices such as prayer and fasting more difficult or inconvenient. Actually, for most of history, people looked to their local church, mosque, or synagogue for guidance on not only the time of day, but the days of the year as well. The dates in particular are a non-trivial question affecting planting, harvest, and other agrarian activities. There's an excellent book about this called The Light Ages. I'll link to it in the description. If you want a good New Year's resolution, you might read that book. It's also worth pointing out that this is mainly a first world problem because rich countries tend to cluster at high latitudes. And near the equator, there is roughly equal night and day all year round. And in extremely high or low latitudes, no one cares much about exactly when they get their few little hours of daylight or night, depending on the season. So in these places, DST is usually not observed at all. When I was young, it was a big production to change all the clocks in the house twice a year. Doing this precisely was a dad thing. We kids would be asked to call the time. That was a phone number with an automated voice that said, "At the tone, the time will be 1 o'clock, beep." In these days of smartphones, we don't need that anymore. So it's not as common to miss our wake-up time or appointments because of the time change. For those of you with coding chops, the major open source libraries for managing DST are ZoneInfo, which is standard in Python 3.9 and later, and Java.time. So changes to the data feeding these standard libraries should make integration of any change system fairly easy. As to the legal aspect of this question, it is possible to change federal standards on DST with ordinary congressional legislation. There was a bill called the Sunshine Protection Act that passed the Senate in 2022 but failed to pass the House. It was introduced again in 2023 but is currently stalled in committee. Although it was introduced by Republican Marco Rubio, it actually has bipartisan support. But the stumbling block is this. Even if we decide to scrap DST, there is a debate over which would be the new constant time, permanent DST or our current standard time. The Sunshine Protection Act opts for permanent DST, and opponents want permanent standard time. If this makes you disgusted about our government's ability to accomplish anything useful, well, I'm with you. Talk about it, Tweedledum and Tweedledee. But it does mean that, unlike many of Trump's other announced policies, it has a chance of actually coming to pass. But of course, another problem will be whether the rest of the world follows suit, which seems unlikely due to politics, red tape, or just plain bloody-mindedness. I can just picture dear leader screeching that if the United States goes with permanent DST, North Korea will never have DST. And even in the US, not all states use DST right now. I don't mean to compare Hawaii to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Hawaii is near the equator and doesn't need the trouble of changing the clocks. Meanwhile, Happy New Year. At least most of us agree on when that happens. I also just wanted to say thank you so much for watching these videos. It's a great deal of fun to make them, and I get a lot of great feedback, and I really appreciate it. Have a wonderful year. Liking and subscribing makes me think more.
Heather thinks about software.